This is The Mob is Dead, a deadly truth series with Becca. No glamour, no legends, no loyalty myths. This is where the suits come off and the violence stays, where power isn't earned, it's enforced, and where fear does more killing than bullets ever did. Tonight, we're not telling a mob story. We're telling the truth about how terror becomes leadership and what happens when it stops working. Before Albert, Anastasia was a boss. Before the nickname, before the fear. He was just a guy who was willing to stab someone to death himself. No legend wrapped in silk suits or whispered promises. Just the brutal arithmetic of a man who understood that fear travels faster than bullets and lasts longer than blood on concrete. But before we try to understand this man, let's start with the day he died. You can see the late morning light slide through the windows of the Park Sheraton Hotel barbershop. The kind of soft, ordinary light that makes a day feel harmless. Anastasia settled into the chair without urgency, his coat draped, his posture relaxed. This was a familiar ritual, quiet, controlled, routine. He stared ahead as the barber worked, watching the room in the mirror the way men like him always did, not nervous, just aware. Nothing about the moment suggested danger. The door opened behind him. Two men entered, their steps unhurried, their presence just out of focus in the mirror. For a split second, Anastasia hesitated. It wasn't fear, it was recognition delayed. The fatal assumption that the people approaching him belonged to him. That pause mattered. In a life ruled by terror, he had grown used to everyone else flinching first. This time, no one did. The shots came fast. The room erupted into noise and motion, the mirror shattering into fragments that reflected nothing back at him. When it was over, the men were already gone, melting into the city like they had never been there at all. The barber chair, meant for comfort, for maintenance, for routine, became the place where fear finally turned inward. Albert died the way he lived at the end, exposed, unprotected, and replaced before the echo faded. In 1920, on the Brooklyn docks, Anastasia and his brother Anthony were involved in the killing of a dock worker named George Whitey Ruddy. And let me stop you right there. Ruddy wasn't some big mob rival. He held no power. His name carried no weight. He was just another body hauling cargo on the docks. That's important, because this wasn't some dramatic underworld showdown. This was about control. The docks were brutal back then. Jobs, unions, money, all of it enforced with fists and knives. Violence wasn't a last resort. It was how things were handled. Ruddy was stabbed to death during a dispute. Anastasia was arrested, charged with murder. This should have been the end of the story, but it wasn't. Witnesses suddenly stopped talking. Testimony fell apart. The case collapsed, and Anastasia walked, not because he was innocent, but because people were already learning what happened when you crossed him. For the men left behind on the docks, Ruddy's death didn't just mean one less set of hands on the cargo. It meant a shift in every morning's air. Guys clenching their lunch pails tighter, eyes darting over shoulders, conversations drying up when a foreman or a stranger came too close. Some started skipping shifts, hoping to avoid trouble. Others learned quickly, silence was safer than justice. This murder tells you everything you need to know about how Anastasia worked. First, he wasn't afraid to get his hands dirty. This wasn't theoretical violence. He was right there. Second, the victim was expendable in the eyes of the system. A dock worker, no political pull, no protection. And third, and this is the big one, the justice system blinked first. That's the moment Anastasia learned the real lesson. You don't need to kill everyone. You just need to make one killing stick in people's minds. One body slumped against weathered crates, blood darkening the splintered wood, seagulls circling overhead, indifferent to human affairs. Word spread fast on the docks, passing from ship to shore in hushed tones between cigarette breaks. So did silence, the kind that falls when men suddenly find their coffee cups fascinating, when eye contact becomes impossible, when testimony evaporates like morning fog over the harbor. After Ruddy's death, Anastasia didn't suddenly become smarter or more strategic. He became useful. People noticed he would cross lines others hesitated at. And once people believe you're capable of that, you don't have to keep proving it. By the late 1920s and into the 1930s, Anastasia didn't have to kill everyone himself anymore. He just had to approve it, and other people took care of the rest. Not because they loved him, but because they were afraid of being next. That's when murder stopped being an act and became a message. A lot of murders get thrown at Anastasia's name. Not all of them are cleanly documented, so we're not playing that game. This one, Ruddy, matters because it's real. It's early, and it shows how the system learned to step aside. Everything that comes after builds on this moment. Anastasia didn't rise because he was clever. He rose because people realized the rules didn't protect them from him. And once that happens, murder doesn't need passion. It just needs permission. Next, how Anastasia helped turn killing into a business and why that made him powerful and eventually disposable. So here's where Anastasia levels up, and not in a good way. At some point in the late 1920s and early 1930s, Anastasia stops being that guy who'll stab someone on the docks and becomes something far more dangerous, the guy who decides who doesn't get to live anymore. This is where Murder, Inc. comes in. Now, despite the name, this wasn't an office with desks and punch clocks. It was looser than that, but the idea was simple and deeply messed up. If organized crime needed someone gone, there was a group whose job was to handle it, and Anastasia sat right at the center of that. He wasn't doing every killing himself anymore. He didn't have to. He was authorizing them. The difference is crucial. Holding the gun means feeling the weight, the recoil, the splatter. Giving the order means clean hands, plausible deniability, and a good night's sleep. Murder becomes paperwork when you're just the signature at the bottom. These weren't random acts of violence. They were targeted, adult victims only. Suspected informants, people who broke rules, people who talked too much, and people who became inconvenient. If someone was marked, it didn't matter how loyal they'd been before. Once the decision was made, it was final. Most of the people carrying out these hits didn't need detailed instructions. They already knew what Anastasia wanted. That's how fear works when it's fully operational. You don't wait to be told. Lots of mob figures ordered murders. Not all of them inspired this level of dread. Anastasia's edge wasn't numbers. It was how unpredictable he was. People around him never knew what would set him off, whether a mistake could be fixed, whether today's favor would matter tomorrow. So they overcorrected. They stayed silent. They acted fast. That's how his reputation did more killing than he ever could personally. This is the moment where murder stops being emotional and starts being procedural. Once killing becomes routine, guilt gets outsourced, responsibility gets blurred, violence feels normal. For Anastasia, murder wasn't rage, it was preservation. Once killing becomes just another form of upkeep, the machine stops requiring demons to operate. It only demands that everyone follows along. The problem with ruling through terror is that it hollows out your inner circle until you're surrounded by people who smile to your face but whisper behind your back. And when fear no longer serves its purpose, it transforms from your greatest weapon into the very thing that gets you killed. Next, we're going to dig into Anastasia's psychology. What kind of person builds power this way? And why this kind of leadership always ends the same way. So let's talk about Anastasia as a person, not the legend, not the nickname, not the mob movie version, because here's the thing, people like this don't usually think they're monsters. They think they're necessary. Anastasia wasn't chaotic the way stories make him sound. He wasn't just flying off the handle for fun. What he was, over and over again, was hyper-focused on dominance. Everything came back to that. Control the room, control the outcome, control the fear. Looking at how he behaved. Again, not diagnosing, just observing. There are a few things that show up consistently. So we have a man who has low tolerance for perceived disrespect. Not actual betrayal, not proof. just the feeling that someone might be crossing him. Then there is the issue of paranoia that increased with power. The higher he rose, the fewer people he trusted. That's not unusual in violent hierarchies. But with Anastasia, it tipped into volatility. What is notable is the instrumental violence. This is important. His violence wasn't emotional release. It was a tool. If killing solved a problem, he used it. If fear solved it faster, even better. That combination is dangerous because it doesn't burn out. The pattern intensifies over time. Anastasia operated through a psychological stranglehold, keeping everyone guessing which misstep might trigger his wrath. He created an atmosphere where rules shifted without warning and punishments varied wildly for identical offenses. Men walked on eggshells around him, never knowing if today's joke would be tomorrow's death sentence. That keeps people compliant, but it also keeps them lying. Nobody brings you bad news. Nobody warns you when things are shifting. Nobody tells you when you've become a liability. And that's where this always turns. Because when fear is the glue holding everything together, the moment someone decides they're less afraid of removing you than keeping you, you're done. This is the part people miss. Anastasia didn't fail because he was sloppy. He failed because his entire power structure depended on others being more afraid of him than of the alternative. Once that calculation changed, once his volatility became bad for business, there was no loyalty left to protect him. Fear doesn't warn you when it's expired, it just disappears. By the 1950s, Anastasia wasn't just violent. He was unmanageable. And in systems built on efficiency, unmanageable people don't get arrested, they get replaced. Next, we'll talk about how that replacement happened and why his death was the most predictable part of his story. By the mid-1950s, Anastasia had a problem, and it wasn't the law. It was that nobody trusted him anymore. The mob world had changed. There was more money on the table, more attention from the government, and less patience for guys who couldn't control themselves. Anastasia didn't adapt. He doubled down on fear, and that only works for so long. Behind the scenes, alliances shifted. People who'd once needed Anastasia's brutality started asking a different question. Is he protecting the business or threatening it? Once that question gets asked, you're already finished. Anastasia walks into the barber shop at the Park Sheraton Hotel in Manhattan, middle of the day, public place. He sits down in the chair. The barbershop door swings open. Two men enter, faces blank as paper. Their hands move beneath their coats, and suddenly the air cracks open with gunfire. Anastasia's body jerks with each impact, blood spattering across the white barber's cape draped around his neck. The man who ruled by terror dies completely exposed, unarmed, seated, unable to do the one thing that ever kept him alive. Charges evaporate, witnesses forget, evidence disappears. The system didn't malfunction. It performed exactly as designed. This wasn't a crime meant to be solved. It was a message meant to be understood. Anastasia wasn't killed because he broke the rules. He was killed because the rules no longer needed him. The same system he enforced with murder removed him without hesitation. No speech, no warning, no loyalty, just a chair, a mirror, and the sound of it being over. Albert was survived by his wife, Elsa Barnesi Anastasia, and their children. After his murder in 1957, the family did exactly what families of men like him almost always do when the power evaporates. They went silent. No public statements, no interviews, no attempts to defend his legacy. That silence isn't accidental. Once Anastasia was killed, his protection died with him. Mob power isn't inherited like money. It's conditional. It exists as long as you're useful and feared. His family didn't control anything, so they were left alone. This is the part people don't like to acknowledge. Families of high-level mob figures often survive because everyone agrees to pretend they don't exist. While the headlines obsessed over mob power and mystery, his family was left with something raw. Kids suddenly steered away from windows, a wife fielding calls that stopped as soon as she answered. Their world shrank fast. from city blocks to shadowed rooms as friends vanished and protection dissolved. For them, his legacy was worry, never knowing if the violence would reach their door or if being forgotten was the only peace left. There's no clean body count for Albert, and anyone who tells you there is selling you mob mythology. What we can say responsibly is this: Anastasia is directly tied to at least one documented hands-on murder early in his career, and he later became a central authority figure in approving killings tied to organized crime enforcement. Once he moved into that role, his involvement shifted from pulling the trigger to giving the nod, and that change multiplied the number of deaths connected to him. Most historians and prosecutors place the number of people he was responsible for in the range of dozens of adult men, often estimated somewhere between 30 and 50, though no court ever proved an exact figure. This deliberate obscurity surrounding the facts is by design. Paper trails didn't exist, people who saw too much disappeared, and orders were given with nods and whispers rather than written directives. The system protected itself through deniability, which is precisely why we'll never have an accurate body count. There's no clinical diagnosis, no psychological evaluation, no medical records. So it would be irresponsible to label Albert Anastasia a psychopath as a fact. What we can do, and this is the honest lane, is look at his behavior patterns and compare them to traits commonly associated with psychopathy. Anastasia consistently showed instrumental violence, killing to achieve control, not emotional release, lack of remorse, shallow emotional attachments, and a willingness to use people as expendable tools. He also displayed poor impulse control under stress, especially later in life, which actually cuts against the classic, cold, highly controlled psychopathy stereotype. What he fits more cleanly is a profile of coercive, dominance-driven personality functioning. Someone who ruled through fear, unpredictability, and intimidation rather than long-term planning or charm. Psychopaths tend to be strategic and emotionally flat. Anastasia was volatile, reactive, and increasingly paranoid as his power grew. So the most accurate way to say it is this: he behaved in ways that overlap with psychopathic traits, but his instability suggests a fear-based authoritarian personality rather than a textbook psychopath. And that distinction matters because it explains why his leadership worked fast, collapsed hard, and ultimately got him killed. Let me give you a moment that tells you why Anastasia was done, without charts, diagnoses, or FBI language. By the early 1950s, people around Albert were on edge all the time, and not in the usual mob, life is dangerous way, in the walking on glass way. There are multiple accounts from people who worked around him, dock guys, associates, hangers-on, who all say the same thing. You never knew which version of him you were going to get. One minute he's calm, almost bored. The next minute he's exploding over something small, a look, a tone, a rumor he heard secondhand. And here's the key part: sometimes he'd back off, and sometimes he wouldn't. No pattern, no logic anyone could rely on. Albert was close to Lucky Luciano, but the relationship was practical, not sentimental. They came up in the same New York underworld orbit in the late 1920s and early 1930s. Luciano was building a modern, business-first crime structure. Anastasia was the guy who handled what Luciano didn't want attached to his name: brains and brutality, aligned by usefulness. Luciano valued Anastasia because he was effective and feared. Anastasia benefited because Luciano's protection elevated him fast. That closeness had an expiration date. Luciano prized predictability and long-term stability. Anastasia prized dominance and intimidation. When Anastasia's volatility started attracting attention and disrupting operations, the relationship cooled. By the time Anastasia was killed in 1957, Luciano was long gone from direct power, and the system he helped design had no emotional loyalty left to extend. Albert wasn't brought down by law enforcement, morality, or justice. He was brought down by organizational evolution. The world he helped enforce outgrew him. The system he terrorized no longer needed terror at the top. The very terror he wielded became his blindfold. When the ground shifted beneath him, not a single voice risked speaking up. This transcends organized crime. This is the universal language of power. Anastasia shows us something uncomfortable but consistent across history. Fear is fast. Fear is efficient. Fear gets results. But fear never builds anything that lasts. It doesn't create loyalty. It doesn't protect families. And it doesn't warn you when you've become the problem. Context explains behavior, but it doesn't absolve power. You've been listening to The Mob is Dead, Deadly Truths with Becca. Fear can build an empire fast, but it never builds one that lasts. When power depends on terror, the ending isn't dramatic. It's efficient. If you found this episode worth your time, follow, rate, and share Deadly Truths wherever you listen. It's the simplest way to keep these stories alive and honest. And remember, the past isn't dead. It just asks you to sit down. This episode is based on historical records, court documents, and contemporaneous reporting. Where exact details are disputed or unknowable, I've flagged that clearly. This isn't myth-making, it's context.